Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
David French, welcome back.
Skye, thanks for having me back.
Okay, so we're going to do kind of a civics lesson today for our SkyPod / Holy Post / French Friday audience. You wrote a piece recently about the need to amend the Constitution, or at least your proposal to amend the Constitution. And before we get into those specifics, to take a step back, a lot of people think there's a lot of bad things happening in American politics and in the American government, abuse of power, corruption, and there's a lot of finger pointing on all sides. But when I think about it, there's kind of two dilemmas we have here constitutionally. One is that the Constitution, as written, was not designed to protect us from every possible corruption or abuse of power that's imaginable. The framers assumed that the American people themselves and our leaders would have some level of character and virtue that they would carry into public office. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the protections that are in the Constitution to prevent corruption and abuse of power aren't being used by our political leaders. So there's not enough of them there, apparently, and the ones that are there are not being used. And then before I kind of turn it over to you to unpack what you think is going on here, when various problems are identified, it seems like everyone's pointing the finger and saying, well, they started it. So thinking about the gerrymandering mess that happened in Texas recently, Trump told Texas to redistrict so that they could gain 5 more Republican seats probably in 2026. And in response to that, California is now going to do the same thing on the Democratic side. Illinois is threatening to do that. And so everyone's doing terrible stuff, but it's always they started it. Or pardons, like Trump is pardoning all kinds of terrible people, but then they point to the Biden administration who also pardoned, abused the pardon power. You've written about the weaponization of the Department of Justice, and there's a lot of finger pointing. Well, they started it, da-da-da. So it seems like we can't rely on our political leaders or the parties to self-regulate or discipline themselves to not abuse power. And that leaves us to, well, is it time we just really need to amend the Constitution? We actually have to put some guardrails in place here because we can't trust our political leaders or the parties to govern themselves. Take us to your column and what you identified as perhaps the most problematic part of the Constitution that you want to change.
Yeah. So I thought that's a great introduction. And there were a lot of people who looked at the 1787 Constitution. And when we're talking about the Constitution, what we're going to be mainly talking about is the Constitution of the first founding, the 1787 Constitution that sets up the balance of power between the branches. And so the second founding, this is the Civil War and the Civil War amendments, was really focused on securing and protecting individual liberty. The first founding was really about establishing this Republican form of government. That's where you get that exchange between Benjamin Franklin. Mr. Franklin, what form of government do we have? A republic, if you can keep it. So they're trying to establish a Republican form of government. And what they were trying to do was to take the traditional role of the monarchy, the absolute rulers that you saw in Europe, and then just break them into different branches of government. And so, whereas the English king, especially well before, the English civil wars and before Parliament asserted its power, the English king was the defender of the faith, the protector of the realm, was the lawmaker, was the adjudicator, was everything.
Right.
And so this first founding takes all of those functions and just spreads them out. It takes the protector of the faith and just throws it out of the government entirely. That's not what we do. Okay, defender of the faith.
Other than defending the right of people to have their faith and not.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yes, exactly. But the government's not the guardian of religious orthodoxy.
Right.
So that's out. Okay. Lawmaking is taken and given to a legislature with a veto. The president has a veto. The commander-in-chief, the leader of the armies, is given to the president, but the power to declare war is given to Congress. The power to adjudicate is put in an entirely separate branch. So you can see how all of this power is diffuse, with the goal being no monarchy. Like that's the nothing that is a monarchy, nothing that looks like a monarchy, nothing that acts or smells like a monarchy. We don't want that. But when the 1787 Constitution,
And sorry if I can interject here, because in my study of this stuff, reading of the Federalist Papers, things like that, there was an assumption then, not just that you would spread out these responsibilities across different branches of government, but there was an assumption by the founders that members of those different branches of government would be protective of their branch and its power.
Yes.
And they didn't really have the imagination that those branches would be populated by people of political parties. And loyalty to political party ends up becoming, in many cases, more important than loyalty to your branch of government. So if you're a Republican in Congress, your loyalty is to your Republican president, not to your other colleagues in the branch of government to whom you belong, which has created all kinds of its own problems.
Yeah. You said that very well. So Madison is thinking when he's writing, ambition must be made to check ambition.
Right.
This is sort of, because nobody, in the framers' minds, nobody's completely trustworthy, which is why when we get in like 3 seconds to the pardon power, why it's so puzzling. But anyway, in the framers' mind, nobody can be fully trusted. And so they're splitting out power for that reason. And they're essentially saying, okay, if I'm the Speaker of the House, what is my ambition? My ambition is to magnify the power of the Speaker of the House. That would be my ambition. That's the way Madison is thinking. So if I'm president, I want to magnify the presidency. If I'm a judge, I want to magnify the judiciary. And so you can see how in their mind, that would set them in competition with each other.
Right.
However, if partisan politics becomes more important than anything else, and I'm a Republican Speaker of the House and there's a Republican president, then the way it works is if I try to maximize my power as Speaker of the House against a Republican president, I will lose my job. That the way the parties lock in, I'm disloyal, I'm Benedict Arnold, I'm a betrayer. You are loyal to your party, and who is the leader of your party? It is the president. And similar on the other side, it's almost a purely reactive thing that if I am a member of Congress and I'm on the other side, my job is to oppose the other party. That is meaning opposing. So the president becomes the sun and everything else orbits around the presidency.
Okay, hold on. Let's pause though for a second. The founders they didn't talk about parties as much as factions. And there was
factions,
right?
Yes.
George Washington in his farewell address warned about the danger of factions in the government and things like that.
Yeah.
So you could argue the founders were a little bit naive because they didn't see the potential of these factions or political parties undermining the division of powers that they had built into the Constitution. However, political parties are not a recent development. It isn't like these things emerged in the 1990s out of nowhere and who could have thought, and now we have all this corruption. Political parties emerged immediately with Adams and Jefferson. And so we've had the dynamics of political factionism or parties shortly after the Constitution was written. And and not to kind of sugarcoat American history, there's been a lot of corruption and problems over the years. But I think a lot of people would argue what we're seeing today is of a completely different caliber of dysfunction of government, right? So how do you explain the fact that despite not anticipating some of this factionalism or party politics, for about 250 years, we've done okay with parties and this factionalism. Off and on. But most people are in agreement, like it is at a breaking point now. What's different about now versus 100 years ago, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you look at that original Constitution, there were a lot of people who are predicting a lot of the things we're dealing with now.
Right.
These were the anti-federalists. So they look at the Constitution and they say, wait a minute, this original Constitution, which I don't like the term co-equal branches of government, it's actually set up for the legislature to be supreme. It initiates spending. It declares war. It can impeach a president. It can impeach a Supreme Court justice.
It's Article 1, for goodness sake. It's the first one.
Article 1.
Yeah,
exactly. And so it's made, and it's a good thing too from a democratic perspective because it's the most representative branch of government.
And most accountable to the voters, most accountable to the people.
Most accountable. Every 2 years, the House of Representatives is in front of the voters. But the anti-federalists look at the presidency, and they looked at the pardon power, where the president could grant pardons for federal offenses to anyone. They looked at the vagueness of the executive vesting clause that invested the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States, and said, look, an unscrupulous person can use the relatively broad, vague grants of power in Article 2 to accumulate an enormous amount of power for themselves. And so the answer that Madison and others had was, yes, but. And the but was two things: a person, George Washington, and a principle, impeachment. Okay. So the founders would say in response that we're defending the original Constitution. Look, if you believe the president is stepping out of bounds, you can impeach. You can absolutely impeach. But the real answer was this original presidency was almost crafted for one person, George Washington.
Yeah. Have you read
The Reluctant President?
Did you ever read Ron Chernow's biography of Washington?
Yeah.
It's so good. And you can understand why that generation of American leaders saw him and said, of course, this is the man who should lead us. This is
what it is.
And they crafted a presidency around somebody of unimpeachable character and virtue, and who was not power hungry, or at least hid it if he was incredibly well. But not all men are George Washington.
Right, exactly. So think about all the ways in which Washington put his imprint on the presidency, beginning with he left after 2 terms. There was no term limit in the original Constitution. This is a huge deal. This is by his own volition and his own example. He steps away. He could have held that for life. He could have been there as long as he wanted to be, but he stepped away. He could have set a precedent that presidents get there and stay until someone removes them. And he set a precedent of stepping back. He set a precedent of graciousness, of refusing power, refusing titles, royal titles. Yeah. He set this example. And think how long the 2-term example lasted until
FDR.
Until Franklin D. Roosevelt. Yeah. I mean, that's a long time. And so the way I would say it is, think of it as this way. Impeachment, as we know, is dead. It was in 2020 when the first senator from the president's own party voted to impeach a president.
Right.
In 2020, that was Mitt Romney. Impeachment does not work. Okay. So let's get that out of the way. And the scripture, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. There have arisen presidents who knew not Washington.
Okay. Let me pause you there again for a second, because maybe this is a chicken and egg kind of question. I have to assume that there were highly ambitious, even perhaps authoritarian-minded or inclined presidents in the past.
Sure.
And yet none of them dared to seek a 3rd term in office before FDR. Was it really because they so esteemed the example of George Washington? Was it because they were so virtuous themselves, having lived off the inertia momentum with it? Or was it the fact that the American people would never have tolerated somebody because the American people had more understanding, more virtue, more esteem for Washington? And if a president had sought a 3rd term, the American people would have just been like, hell no. And they knew that. They knew there's no way I could get away with this, so they didn't dare try. And now we're in a very different place.
Yeah, I think it's a yes to both. I mean, but not always yes to both. So, of course, there were some presidents who, if they wanted to be a monarch, if they could have been a monarch, in their heart of hearts would be a monarch, I'm sure.
Right.
At the same time, there were presidents who, no, that's the right model. You step aside. This is how you preserve a republic. Mm-hmm. And then hovering against the background was a combination of the people and the elites of the time, the members of Congress, et cetera, who were very firmly convinced that Washington had set the standard. And so, let's suppose somebody was a demagogue megalomaniac and they wanted to stay. For a while, it would have been unthinkable, because the argument would have been, do you actually think you're more valuable to the country than George Washington?
Right.
Who do you think you are exactly, right? And so, but, and I would say, when FDR chose to run for that 3rd term, he did break through a norm so dramatically that it was very quickly after he did that we had the constitutional amendment for term limits.
Right.
Right.
And he did it at an extraordinary time. both the Great
very
Depression
extraordinary time.
and World War
Yes.
II and all that. So, and no doubt he had a very healthy ego, but yes,
I have very mixed feelings about it.
But that's my point. When he did break into that third term, the response of the American people was, okay, yeah, we voted for him for a third term, but we don't want this to be the norm. We're going to codify the Washington example of a 2-term limit, and they passed the amendment. But this also gets to the fact that beyond the Constitution, or including the Constitution, there were a number of societal and political guardrails against authoritarian abuse of power. So as much as we've been kind of trashing on the political parties, they had a positive role to play in a lot of this. The parties and the party bosses used to be gatekeepers to make sure that completely corrupt, unacceptable characters were not given the chance at political power. They were just barred from running for various offices. That was more or less undone by the primary system that came into effect in 1974.
Yeah.
And then, in a way, campaign finance reform actually diminished the power of political parties because it allowed small donor giving to bypass some of those gates. The Electoral College, as originally conceived, was in a way an opportunity to not give the people direct say in who they put into the White House, because electoral college members could bypass the will of the people and vote for whoever they wanted. That's changed. Congress, you mentioned, has the power to impeach. They've never done it significantly. No one until Mitt Romney had the guts to vote to convict a president of their own party. And then the last check was always the people.
Yeah.
Right. So,
yeah.
But in order for the people to be a check on corruption and authoritarianism, we mentioned that if Congress doesn't fulfill its duty to protect the Constitution and refuses to impeach a corrupt president, then the people should vote those bums out, right? They should kick the Congress out and put new people. Well, that depends on two things. One, they have to have a working knowledge of our Constitution and our political system. They have to be trained and educated in basic American civics. I think it'd make a pretty good case based on data that most Americans, they can't even name the 3 branches of government, let alone know. But then the other thing is they have to actually be informed enough by the media as to what's going on. And now we have a media ecosystem that is siloed and broken and driven by business interests rather than actually informing the electorate. So all the checks from top to bottom that had been there in generations past feel like they've broken down.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the Electoral College and the primary system. So the Electoral College would have been, if you're going to go back to 1787, one of the trump cards to say, yeah, we're going to not have a horrible person because of the Electoral College.
Right. The people might vote for a terrible person, but they're not getting in.
They're not getting in because the original vision of the Electoral College was not just some sort of bean counting exercise that we used to give smaller states slightly greater say. The original intention of it was, think of it as a committee meeting of wise men to select a president. That was the original intention of this thing. So in that circumstance, getting together, 100, 150, or however many, it's built over the years, 528 now, 528 of America's most esteemed leaders who get together. The intention was that they would then get together like the Vatican almost.
Yeah, like a conclave.
And the white smoke comes out and the president is announced. And so they would have been puzzled at the idea that their Constitution did not protect against a demagogue because the whole way the president was selected bypassed popular vote. And so but the diminishment of the Electoral College and turning it into essentially just a slight tweak, very meaningful, but slight tweak to popular vote elections, that is not what was intended. And so you strip away one thing that was protecting against the rise of this demagogue, and then you've got the other diminished protections, the example of Washington, impeachment, et cetera. And then Skye, yeah, you brought up a great point that one of the reasons why our system was more stable prior to the modern era was we did not have the open primary system.
Yeah.
We did have a version.
I hate it. I wish I could just make it go away.
I hated it. And so what we did have in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party was kind of a version of an electoral college.
Right.
It was, you had party leaders and party delegates who had a much more sort of institutional view, were selecting their candidates. And so
the proverbial smoke-filled room.
The smoke-filled room.
Yeah.
Then once the primaries started, about the primary system there in the Army, we used to use this term for plans that sounded great, but in practice were awful. It briefed well. The primary system briefs well, like more people, more participation. But the reality is, you do get more people and more participation, but the people who participate in primaries and the people who are small dollar donors are not representative of the larger public. And so this is how you get to this point where every couple of years, every 4 years, you have this now perennial, complaint. How did we get these two?
Right. I forget the exact statistic, but in 2016, the Republican primary, I think Donald Trump, obviously, he won the nomination of the party. I think it was with less than 20% of Republican primary votes.
Well, the raw numbers, I believe, if I remember correctly, he got about 17 million primary votes. So if you're going to add up all of the votes that he got in the primary, it would be about 17 million. And then in the general election, he gets about, 77 million-ish, somewhere around there. Similarly, Biden in the primary, he ran largely unopposed. He got about 15 million votes. Kamala Harris gets about 75 million votes. So you can see that that's a very real way to quantify how small the primary electorate is compared to the general electorate.
Okay, but if we were to steelman this stuff, we would say the changes to the Electoral College, where it's actually the electors are bound by the popular vote to, cast their ballot for the person who won their state. The party change towards a primary system. You could make the case that all of this is in the service of expanding democracy, giving more people, more of the American people, more of a voice in selecting their leaders. And who could be against that? You could make a case theologically, it may not be the best, but it's an American value that we want to expand the number of people, enfranchise as many people as possible in the vote. But that gets back to the other piece I mentioned, which is if the people are the final check on corruption and authoritarianism, then you need people who understand how the government operates and are properly informed about what's actually going on. And you and I have talked many times about how so many people don't have a clue what's going on.
Yeah.
Because they exist in a media silo that doesn't inform them. And I'm not saying that only exists on one side. There are silos all over the place that we exist. And then the media doesn't see its role primarily as informing and educating an electorate to make good decisions with their vote. They see it as, we want to keep eyeballs glued to our screen so that we can sell them catheters and gold. And that, that's not a great way to run a republic.
No, and look, we have had massive problems with the partisan press in the past, and it has not worked out well for us. One of the instigators, and I'm fascinated not by the fact that we had a civil war. I think that with slavery so entrenched in the South and growing abolitionism in the North, I think most folks would have been, most folks sort of seeing that with kind of the God's eye view would have seen how entrenched the Southern states were going to be, and they were not going to let go of their peculiar institution without force. And so I'm not surprised that a civil war happened in America. I'm always interested in why it happened when it did. What were the things that were the triggering? And one of the things that was triggering the Civil War, and this is part of what I looked at in my book that came out in 2020, was conspiracy theories in the partisan press.
Yeah.
And the partisan press whipped, in particular, Southerners into a frenzy after John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And so when Brown was imprisoned and tried and executed, there were parts of the North that really celebrated him. And the way that Southern media portrayed that was they were celebrating John Brown's abolitionism, but really celebrating his desire to trigger a slave rebellion that would kill a bunch of white Southerners. And so it was sold as the Northerners are like in a frenzy for your blood. The Northerners are wanting you dead. I mean, how much have we heard that kind of rhetoric now, right?
So it sells, right?
Yeah.
Terror and outrage sells.
If you read the Texas Secession Declaration, it contains a conspiracy theory that people from the North were trying to poison people in Texas, poison them. And so the party, and we arguably the Spanish-American War is whipped up in part by, because of hysterical journalism, So we have had problems in the past. The way I would put it right now is we're taking a lot of problems we've had before and they're kind of cascading together.
Yeah.
We've had problems with populism and demagoguery, especially in the South and the Huey Long era and all of that. That's emerging now. We've had problems with the partisan press before the Civil War, Spanish-American War, other periods. That's emerging now. We've had problems with presidential power grabs. We've had Woodrow Wilson in World War I and the way he tried to explicitly punish his political enemies. Mm-hmm. So you're taking several of these things and you're putting them all together in one moment. And I think that's one of the reasons why everything feels so fraught.
The metaphor that comes to mind is a rogue wave. I don't know if you've ever...
Yeah.
Right? So it's not a tsunami. Mm-hmm. A tsunami is caused by a seismic event under the ocean floor. But a rogue wave is this rare phenomenon where different waves traveling across the ocean, they just so happen to line up that their wavelengths connect and they multiply the size of this massive wave, and it leads to catastrophic destruction. It can sink huge ships, whatever, but you can't prevent them. You can't predict them. They just line up. And that seems like what's happening right now is you do have these different movements in American history that have done damage at different times, but they're all happening at the same time, which could lead to catastrophic upheaval.
I would say we can actually identify the rogue wave.
Yeah.
And it's the year 2020. So think about this, and because I genuinely, Skye, think that what we're dealing with right now in the aftershock, we're dealing with the aftershocks of the way that 2020 broke into people's brains in many, many ways. So think about this. This is my colleague Michelle Goldberg said this on, I think it was on the Argument podcast towards the end of the year. She said, in 1 year, we went through 1918, a pandemic, 1929, a stock market crash, 1974, an impeachment crisis, and 1968, a wave of riots.
And assassination attempt. Oh, that was 2024. Sorry. Yeah, but
assassination of 2024, but also in 2020, if you're going to bleed into the very beginning of 2021, a coup attempt, unlike anything we'd seen in American history. So all of those things are happening together. And I think that rogue wave wiped out a lot of our civil society. I think it wiped out a lot of our mutual feeling of shared citizenship. I think it wiped out a lot of there was rising animosity before 2020. I think it just tipped us over. And then what we're dealing with right now is the aftershock of all of that, the consequence of that rogue wave. That like the ship is listing, the water's coming in through all the bulkheads, and that's sort of my little theory.
Okay, I think we've done a pretty good job of diagnosing the problem.
Yeah.
Let's get back to a potential fix or partial fix, which is amending the Constitution.
Yeah.
I think it was your show, Advisory Opinions, where you had some constitutional scholar on at some point. I don't know what episode it was or who it was.
We always have some.
You always have somebody. And one of you or Sarah asked the scholar, what would surprise the founders or the framers of the Constitution if they were dropped into our time and saw, what we're doing with the law and constitution, all that? What would surprise them? And I think the scholar said, they'd be most surprised that we haven't amended the Constitution more. Because one of the arguments for ratifying the Constitution, with all of its flaws and imperfections, was it can always be amended. Like it's built in.
We can fix it.
We can fix it.
Yeah.
Right? We have the Bill of Rights and all the other amendments. We'll fix it. And future generations of Americans will adapt the Constitution to the circumstances and crises and realities of their time. They didn't see it as a frozen document. And we have amended the Constitution, but it's been a while. So
it's been a while.
We get into why that is, but put that aside. You wrote your piece arguing for the need to amend the first sentence of Article 2 of the Constitution. You quoted it earlier. As it's currently stated, Article 2 begins, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. What's problematic about that sentence, and how does that contribute to the problems we're seeing right now? And what was your prescribed amendment?
Yes. Okay. So what is problematic about it? Well, if you go back and you read the Anti-Federalists, now I've been rereading more and more of the Anti-Federalists as we've been facing strains in our constitutional system. And it's kind of eerie to go back and read them and see what they could forecast. Now, I think they saw some of these things happening sooner rather than as late as they are now, but they really did see a lot of this. So what they're in an Anti-Federalist paper, Cato 4. Cato, who is the pen name for what we believe to be Governor George Clinton of New York, who was a long-standing colonial governor, one of the early vice presidents of the U.S., one of the founding fathers, that he said that language was vague and inexplicit, and that, in other words, it creates an ambiguity. And the ambiguity is very clear in the words, the executive power. What is the executive power? That's not a self-defining term. Now, there's some symmetry here. Article 1 grants the legislative power to Congress. Article 2, the executive power to the president. And Article 3, the judicial power to the judiciary. So it lends itself to what is the executive power. And it's not a self-explanatory sentence. Now, there have been a lot of people who've done some really excellent historical work. And they said, look, when they said the executive power, that meant the responsibility to execute the laws passed by Congress. That's what it meant.
Well, executive means the one who executes.
You're executing. Yes.
You are the one enacting these things passed by Congress. And the fact that it's Article 2 coming after Article 1, which outlines all of Congress's power, it seems a logical way of defining this, but some people have taken it much, much farther.
Right. And so what has emerged in the intervening years is something called a unitary executive theory, and then what you would call Trump executive theory, which is an extension of unitary executive theory. So what is unitary executive theory? Unitary executive theory, in a sentence, is the president is the executive branch. In other words, if you're going to talk about the executive branch, it's one person, it's the president, and at its core. So therefore, any attempt to limit the president's power over the executive branch is a constitutional nullity.
I have a question about that. You're the best person I know to ask this. Does that mean, if you really take that to its logical end, does that mean that Congress cannot pass any legislation that would force the president to create certain structures for the execution? So here's what, I'll give you an example. Like if Congress passes a law saying, okay, we're passing a bill saying that water needs to be clean and can only have, so many problems, whatever. It needs to be clean water is important. Can they then also in that bill say, and the way this shall be done is we're going to create a department of environmental protection that shall be led by a cabinet secretary, or is that going too far? Is that infringing on the executive power? And all they can do is pass a bill saying, we want clean water. That then goes to the president's desk, and it's completely up to the president to decide what's the best way to achieve that, because he alone is the executive.
Great question. So let me distinguish between what I would call mainstream unitary executive theory and hardcore extreme unitary. So mainstream unitary executive theory would say, yes, absolutely, Congress can establish a Department of Energy. Congress can even, for low-level employees, non-policy-making employees, establish civil service protections. Congress can require presidents to spend money in accordance with congressional directives within that Department of Energy. However, Congress cannot limit the president's ability to hire and fire policy-making employees, and that Congress cannot constrain, even as it creates a Department of Energy, it still cannot constrain the president's policy-making discretion within those agencies. To the extent there is discretion, executive power discretion, the president is going to have a policy-making role here that Congress is going to be limited in its ability to impact. And now that is sort of a soft unitary executive. That's the unitary executive theory that I grew up with in the law, so to speak. And in that's where you have some conflict over concepts like independent agencies. Wait a minute.
Right.
It's got to be a legislative agency or an executive agency. It's got to be one of those two. And if you put it in the executive and there's policy-making functions, then that's under the control of the president. And the president can hire and fire the policy-making officials. Hardcore unitary executive would be, well, yeah, Congress, you can appropriate, say, $50 billion for capital improvements at public universities, or $50 billion for X or Y or Z. And you can articulate what the purpose is. And the president can then choose how he executes it. So if he wants to funnel it through like a Department of Education or not, that he can do that. That would be extreme, like an extreme view. That in essence, what Congress can do is tell the president, clean the air and appropriate money for it, or seal the border and appropriate money for it. But if the president is going to, however many employees that takes, many or few, what kind of agency that takes, then that's going to be up to a president.
Okay. So this is where we get into the problem with the second article. There's ambiguity here about what this means. Let me try to, for people who are totally losing it and not.
Wait, there's some people checking out.
Yeah, like
right
I'm out of here. Okay, let me try. Let's give a really simple example that you mentioned it earlier. The border. Congress passes a law saying we want the border secured, and here's $50 billion to secure that border. What I'm hearing you say is the extreme radical view of the unitary executive would say that's all Congress can do. From that point forward, it's entirely up to the president on how that money is spent, where it's spent, what it really means to secure the border. And that president might decide, I'm only going to spend half of that money, and it's all going to be like drones guarding the border and robots, and that's it. And that's up to him or her to decide. And if he doesn't spend all the money, that's fine. If he does spend all the money, that's fine. But that's the extent that Congress can do. Others would say, no, Congress can pass a bill that says, here's $50 billion to secure the border. And that means building a wall and hiring border agents and They could specify all kinds of things and what this looks like. And the president is just the one who has to do that and report back to Congress that it's been done. That's the difference here. So how much latitude does the president have to do whatever the heck they want? And how much power does Congress have to tell the president what he or she must do?
So that extreme versions you're talking about. Another way, let's take a real life case. There's litigation right now around the Department of Education. And the Trump administration is essentially trying to unwind or dismantle the Department of Education as much as it legally can. And so it has fired a ton of people, just a ton of people. And so one of the arguments is going to the Supreme Court is that, hey, look, Congress can tell us, hey, we're going to fund a student loan program, but it's up to us as to how we do that and how many employees that's going to take, et cetera.
And hold on a second.
So you really are.
My understanding is also Congress created the Department of Education.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It wasn't the president, a past president who created that department.
Yeah,
Congress
exactly.
created it, but the president's dismantling it.
Yeah. And so that even the existence of a, quote, Department of Education, they might acquiesce that, well, we can have a titular Department of Education, but how we execute this plan on Congress is entirely up to us. And we can gut it, we can staff it, we can do what we want as long as we are, and as long as we are, well, and this is where it gets squirrely. Okay, so Jack Goldsmith, professor at law school professor at Harvard, said, and a former senior DOJ official under George W. Bush, got the best description of this is the Trump theory of executive power, and it's got 4 components. A, the Constitution vests all of the executive power in the president. B, all subordinate executive branch officials are removable at will by the president. C, the president's Article 2 duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed entails an exclusive presidential power to decide which laws to enforce or not. And D, the president can thus direct and control all subordinate executive officials. So you can see how that is moving so far beyond like the general, what I called normal unitary executive, that it really takes Congress and puts it into an advisory role.
Well,
if you can decide what laws to enforce or not.
So we talked about this months ago, and maybe it's Exhibit A in how the Trump administration is doing this. Prior to coming into office, Congress passed a bill that required the sale of TikTok, or the shutdown of TikTok in the United States, unless its Chinese owner sold it to an American-owned company. And the Biden administration said, we're on our way out. We're not dealing with this. This is Trump can deal with this. Trump gets into office and has just completely ignored that law and said, I'm not going to shut down TikTok, and I'm not going to require it to be sold. So, I mean, a lot of people go, who cares? It's TikTok. Well, it's what it represents. It's the president of the United States saying the Article 1 branch of government, Congress, can't tell me what to do because I'm Article 2. I'm the unitary executive. Yeah. And because I'm responsible for executing the laws, if I don't want to execute it, you can't make me. And my understanding is the way that Congress was supposed.
I just want to give a shout out to I'm sorry, go ahead.
My understanding is if things were actually functioning the way they're supposed to, Congress would look at that and go, no, you're violating your constitutional oath because you're not executing the laws we passed and you're getting impeached and removed. But we all know that's never going to happen. So there's no reason why this president or any other president should care what Congress says.
Yeah. And let me just give a brief shout out to my unitary executive scholars out there in law school land. I know that when I read that A, B, C, and D, you are all jumping up and down and saying, that's not unitary executive. That's something crazy and more. Yes, you're correct. That is a extension well beyond what would have been any kind of mainstream unitary executive theory, but that's where we are. This is where the presidency is.
Yeah.
And so what does this mean, Skye? As you're walking through and talking about all of this, think about how vulnerable we are, and without knowing it, to a truly terrible power-grasping demagogue. How all of these things have come together, all of these streams have come together at once. The rogue wave smashed into the ship. The ship is listing to port, and now we are extremely vulnerable, and even more vulnerable than we were before 2020 to this kind of, demagogic power. And the checks have failed. And that's why I have proposed and look, let me just say, I know that the odds of a constitutional amendment happening now are zilch, zero, nada, none.
Right.
I know that. But I also know something else. I also know that in American history, we've had cycles like this, where there has been intense polarization, intense conflict, and in the past, they have always ended with at least one party having a period of dominance. And so what I am saying is that if and when we reach the point where we're looking at the rubble of what we've done to our country, and we say, how can we stop this from happening again? I'm over there in my corner with my hand raised saying, I've got this idea that, hopefully we've been chewing on for a bit in the public square. And my idea is to change the sentence, the vesting clause sentence, away from the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America, to read, a president of the United States of America shall execute laws passed by Congress. And that makes explicit what was sadly implicit in the original vesting clause. That the executive power means you execute laws passed by Congress. Now, presidents would still have veto power. There would still be judicial review. They'd still, have the power to negotiate treaties, et cetera, et cetera. But this would make it very clear that if, for example, there's a Department of Education, you got to keep it going. If there are civil service protections, you got to protect employees from arbitrary firing. That if it would make it very clear that it is Congress that is passing the laws, and the laws are set by Congress. And then the president's responsibility is to steward and execute those laws.
Okay. I think it's a great idea, but part of the reason we are where we are is not simply the fact that this president, as well as some previous presidents, have tried to maximize their power under Article 2. Part of the reason we're here is because there's a whole lot of members of Congress that are abdicating their power under Article 1.
Sure.
So simply specifying that the president is the second article, not the first, and needs to obey and execute the laws passed by Congress doesn't guarantee that Congress will do its job in ensuring it's passing laws, number one, and that it's holding the president accountable for executing them. So that raises this other thing I wanted to talk about, which is another piece you wrote just today about the president's weaponization of the Department of Justice, and combining that with the president's pardon power in Article 2 creates a really interesting, and we already talked about how the president seems like he can ignore whatever laws he wants that Congress passes and choose which ones to execute. But then when you combine that with his pardon power, it means anybody who does run afoul of the law, he has the power to get him off the hook. We saw him do that with all of the January 6 rioters. No matter how passive or violent they may have been, he just pardoned all of them. And so he's able to use the Justice Department, his executive power, and the pardon power to essentially reestablish a monarchy in America, to be both the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branches all in one. Is that another area that you think needs to be looked at, and perhaps an amendment brought forward to change the president's pardon power so that it can't be abused so aggressively?
Oh, I think we're flunking a national IQ test if we don't do that. I mean, to be honest. And I said that in my piece. I mean, I said, look, amending the pardon power to me is just, we now, and I think this will only become more apparent. I would almost guarantee you this, Skye, as this Trump term comes to an end, especially if a Democratic president is elected if a Democrat wins the election in 2028, you're going to see the issuance of pardons at a scale that may well boggle the mind.
Right. Like anybody who ever worked for the Trump administration gets a pardon.
And I think there's going to be reason why Trump would be worried about prosecutions of separate and aside from being worried about a vindictive reverse weaponization, right? That, look, there's a lot of squirrely stuff going on in the markets right now. There's a lot of weird indicators around, like when Trump makes announcements about tariffs, et cetera, that there appears to be people tracking trading patterns or seeing evidence of insider trading going on. We don't know who, what, why. I mean, there's a lot we don't know, but there's a lot of smoke out there.
To be fair, it's not just Trump and the executive branch that seems to be engaging in this, but there's a ton of it, and there's for a long time been going on in Congress.
Oh, yeah.
Because they, as a leader in the House or in the Senate, you have access to a whole lot of information that's not public. And there's no regulation or law against people elected to seats in Congress engaging in this kind of insider trading. I feel like that's a no-brainer amendment
That's a big no-brainer.
That we should be passing, that you can't have a seat in government and be using your role to get rich in the stock market.
Oh, that's a no-brainer. There's several no-brainer. I think that's an absolute no-brainer. Yeah. But you're going to see, I think you're going to see, I mean, and then look, there's a lot of weird things happening in the crypto industry right now about, there's just a lot of very strange things going on where you're seeing a lot of people kind of right in front of our faces cashing in on power and access in pretty dramatic ways. And so I think what you're going to end up seeing is an exercise of the pardon power towards the end of this Trump term that's going to take your breath away. Well, and I was going to say that may create some real demand. That may create some demand where you can actually get the ball rolling on a pardon amendment.
What about the Department of Justice in general? You wrote this wonderful piece, and I know you and Sarah have been talking about it on your podcast about the things the Trump administration is doing, which are breaking all kinds of norms. For example, it's long been a norm in the Justice Department that they will not announce if there's an investigation into an American citizen for anything because they may find nothing in the course of that investigation. Yeah. So they don't typically announce any names until someone's actually indicted for a crime because it's just unfair because that citizen has no way to defend themselves. It brings up, but the Trump administration has thrown that norm out the window and they're like, oh yeah, we're investigating this person and that person and the other, and they all happen to be political adversaries of the president. Those kinds of things are happening now. Is the genie out of the bottle? Is there any way to go back? Is there any way to reestablish norms once they're broken?
Oh, it's so hard. I mean, it's so hard. And it's it's impossible to do it actually without Congress intervening as well. So for example, let's suppose at the end of these 4 years, let's just look at what's happening now. Let's say at the end of the 4 years, you have present trends continue, and you have a Department of Justice that is an engine of political vengeance against MAGA's enemies, and has given a complete pass to public corruption from Republicans or public corruption from Trump's allies. And you have it staffed, especially at the senior leader levels, from top to bottom with MAGA zealots. Okay. Well, the next president who comes in to make the Department of Justice, just to simply restore it back to, for a temporary time period, to restore it back to prior practices and standards, would involve purging a giant number of people again.
Yeah.
And so you would have just had the purge to get the DOJ to where it is fully magnified. You'd have to repurge it to get it unmagnified. And the whole time it's being repurged, all of the MAGA figures are going, look, see, they're just like us. Right. It's all the same.
This is the finger pointing that I was talking about at the beginning, where each side is just saying they started it. And so we're okay doing this now.
But so that's why I say it's going to take Congress to step in and pass some enduring reforms that you just won't have the next president coming in and doing the big turnover. But again, if you have that unitary executive, that extreme unitary executive, then even those congressional reforms are going to be subject to defiance from future presidents.
Even if you don't have a unitary executive, what incentive do members of Congress have for passing those reforms if it's essentially it would also hand-tie their own party, right? They don't want their I got into a conversation recently about the redistricting that's going on in Texas, and Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who's decided to engage in proportional warfare with Texas, saying
tit for tat,
saying no, we're the Democrats in California, we're going to do the same thing. And two wrongs don't make a right, but some people are standing up and saying, hey, this is insane. We can't just everything terrible that one side does, the other side matches it. Someone has to be the bigger person or the bigger party, the one who stands up for what's right in the Constitution. And yet no one wants to do it because who wants to be the person fighting with one hand tied behind their back when you're going up against an unvirtuous foe?
So here's the paradox, Skye. Here's the absolute paradox. I don't think we can diminish the power of the presidency without presidential leadership diminishing the power of the presidency.
In other words, we need another George Washington or Abraham
Bingo.
Lincoln. Yeah.
Bingo. And I have for a long time resisted that notion because it doesn't feel, if you sit there and you say, okay, I have a plan, I have a policy. So like my colleague, Ezra Klein, his wonderful book about abundance, that's putting forward a plan, that's putting forward a set of policies that I think provide a framework for reform that could be really important for America. And so for a long time, I've sort of thought that's how you do it. You put forward a plan. And now, because if you're expressing a hope for a person, that's just a hope. That's not a plan, right? But now I've had a little bit of different thought about that. I thought that presenting a framework for republic-saving leadership is kind of a plan in the sense that you're presenting a vision that a leader can adopt. And so that to me, I feel like if you're going to talk about how do we survive this rogue wave, how do we build a prospering republic going forward, I think you're wanting to do is putting out, like, it's almost like you're putting out an audition call for a Washington, Lincoln type figure, but with the specific vision of what that would mean. Here's the vision for leadership to help this republic survive. And so that's a hope and a plan at the same time, Skye. But I do think I've come to the conclusion that it's going to take visionary leadership. There's too many barriers to sort of all of America adopting three amendments to save America. No. They're going to be chanting a person's name.
Yeah.
And the person whose name is being chanted needs to have the 3 or 2 or 4 amendments.
So it sounds like we need the plan, and there's various people, including yourself, who are throwing out ideas for what that plan could be, the amendments or structural changes that need to be adapted. Then you need the vehicle to carry that forward, which is a leader. And I would say not just a visionary leader, but a virtuous leader who won't take that public support and construct something that benefits themselves.
Yeah.
But like Washington can say,
we're
going to push through these changes for the sake of the country, and I will embody those changes in my character, in the way I operate as an executive, and I will release control and power. So I mean, it's Maximus in Gladiator, right? Where he wants to give Rome back to the people and make it a republic again, and be virtuous and surrender. But my goodness, who could that possibly be? When I look, I don't obviously know a lot of people in political leadership, but gee, it doesn't seem like we're bringing out our best and brightest these days for public office, because it's such a horrific place to be. It seems to draw, creatures from under the rock.
This is a matter of fervent prayer, Skye. I mean, like if you look at key moments in American history, Washington, one of my favorite books to read about the founding era is this book called Valiant Ambition. And it traces the competing arcs of Benedict Arnold and George Washington. And you could see that with different leadership, what was existing in the American Revolution could have gone very badly.
Right.
And we could have created a very bad republic, given some of the character of some of the opposition to Washington out there. If you go and you look at some of the presidents who were leading up to the Civil War, they were some of the most, some of the best things you could say about them is they were just total mediocrities.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have Lincoln. That's providential. That's providential that we had Lincoln. So that's providential that you had a Washington. So some of this has got to say it's got to be providential, that we've been and we also know that key moments in American history when we've not had effective, bold leadership. Think about the Compromise of 1877 that ends Reconstruction. We have suffered generations of consequences for poor or mediocre leadership. And we're kind of in that right now. And the question is do we have it in ourselves? Is there that figure that can be born out of this culture? That's the question.
What's frightening to me is statistics would tell us that somewhere between 30 and 35% of Americans think Donald Trump is a George Washington kind of figure.
Yeah.
They believe he is that virtuous leader who's going to hand the republic back to the people, drain the swamp, fix all, and that brings me back to an uninformed electorate that lives in a media silo that reinforces that perception and has no idea what's actually going on. And maybe there's 30% on the other side who think, a Biden or someone else like that is their George Washington. But I think the majority of Americans are smart enough to realize we haven't had a George Washington kind of transformative figure in a very, very long time. And I'm not saying everybody who's occupied that office has been completely corrupt or unvirtuous. There have been virtuous people in those offices, but we need more than a virtuous person right now. We need a virtuous and visionary leader who, with the backing of a great plan and the support of a majority of Americans, can bring structural change that's unprecedented in our lifetimes. So
in our lifetimes,
that's a big lift.
Yeah.
That's a very big lift.
It's a heavy, but it's a heavy moment. And to get out of a heavy moment, I think we can muddle through. There's a difference between muddling through and we can muddle through with normal presidents after this, but we'll be diminished, I think, Skye. So what we're talking about is something other than muddling through. How do you break through rather than muddle through? And here's what's so grievous. I think a lot of Americans are ready for a significant change, but we have one community whose super majority support for this president is propping him up. And that's the evangelical church. I mean, it is really remarkable to me, Skye, the extent to which this guy depends almost completely on this supermajority evangelical support to maintain where his power, his hold, everything that he's doing. There's just this incredible poll out of Pew Research Center that shows that white evangelicals, this is in April of this year, had a 72% approval rating of Trump.
Yeah.
The next highest approval rating amongst any religious subgroup was white Catholics at 51%. So that's a 21-point difference. And so you really do have, and we've had a lot of supermajority demographic support for people before. I mean, Black Democrats, Black Americans supermajority for Democrats. We've had this before. But what makes this in some ways particularly troublesome and dangerous is the level of religious zeal attached to this dedication is what is turning this all up to 11.
Okay.
So,
we got to wrap this up. We could talk a lot longer. It sounds like you're adding a necessary component into the sequence of ingredients that we talked about earlier. We talked about the need for a virtuous and visionary leader. You talked about the need for a plan that would reform the structural deficiencies of our current political system. Maybe the thing that comes even before that is we need a spiritual awakening or repentance on the part of at least the evangelical church in America, if not more broadly, to recognize the deception under which they have fallen and the way that they have exchanged their Christian birthright for a bowl of bad political porridge. Until they wake up and come to a deeper commitment to the way of Christ, you may not get that public support for that new plan that would then equip a virtuous and visionary leader to be able to pull it off. It sounds like the order.
I'm afraid, and this is one of the things I wrote in my book. The heart change has to precede everything else. There has to be at least a glimmering of an opening towards your fellow citizens and towards and a glimmering of hope and faith that you can relinquish power and that the will to power is not the only thing keeping your liberty alive. And I think that that message has been sold to the church for so long that it's so deeply culturally embedded that is in essence America and the church are over unless the church is in charge. And that message has leaked into the Christian culture to such an extent that it's going to be incredibly difficult to pry it out.
Oh, my goodness. David, on that hopeful note, we're going to wrap it up. I look forward to seeing the conversation from our Holy Post Plus subscribers about all of this. Thank you for your insights, for your wisdom, for your perspective. I always enjoy these conversations and look forward to doing another one next month.
Oh, I can't wait. And Skye, I could talk founding for hours. And that's just what the people want,
That's
right?
Exactly
they just want more.
It's what I want. It's what I want. Thanks, David. hey, make a sacrifice to the algorithm gods and like and subscribe to this video and our content. It's the only way they will honor us on YouTube.